In 1932, a coal miner's wife in Kentucky fed her family of 8 on a single sack of potatoes that cost less than a quarter. Some nights that sack was the only thing in the house. Today we treat the potato as a side dish we barely notice, but there was a time when the potato was dinner, breakfast, and the reason a family survived the winter. Number 14 on this list fed more depression children than any relief program ever did. Number 3 was so cheap that mothers were almost ashamed to admit they served it. And number 1 kept whole mining towns alive. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man potato dinners our grandmas swore by. Number 25, fried potatoes and onions. This was the meal that proved you did not need meat to make a family come to the table. 2 or 3 potatoes sliced thin, 1 onion cut into rings, and a spoonful of bacon grease from the can that lived on the back of every stove. Your grandmother would heat that grease in a cast iron skillet until it shimmered, lay the potatoes in flat, and let them cook low and slow without touching them for 10 minutes so a golden crust could form. Then she turned them, folded in the onions, and let the whole thing crisp at the edges while the onions went soft and sweet. A 50-pound sack of potatoes cost about $1 at a farm market, and the grease was free, saved from breakfast. For families across Ohio, Indiana, and the hollows of West Virginia, this was Wednesday supper. The potatoes soaked up the smoky fat and turned into something no boiled potato could ever be. Children asked for seconds. Fathers asked about thirds. Nobody at that table felt poor. Number 24, watered potato and onion soup. When the money ran out before the week did, your grandmother reached for the cheapest soup a person could make. 3 or 4 potatoes diced small, 1 onion, salt, pepper, and a pot of plain water. That was the whole thing. She simmered it until the potatoes broke apart on their own and thickened the water into a broth that tasted far richer than its ingredients had any right to. A pat of butter or a spoonful of drippings stirred in at the end turned it from thin to comforting. For a widow in Missouri or a laid-off mill hand in Pennsylvania, this cost almost nothing and filled every bowl on the table. The potatoes made their own creaminess as the starch dissolved, no milk required. Served with a heel of bread for dunking, it stretched a nearly empty cupboard into a hot meal. Some nights the whole pot cost less than a nickel, and it kept people fed until payday finally came. Number 23, grated potato pancakes. Long before anyone called them latkes on a menu, immigrant grandmothers across the Midwest and the Northeast were grating raw potatoes for supper. 2 potatoes grated fine, squeezed dry in a clean dish towel, mixed with an egg, a spoonful of flour, salt, and a little grated onion. Then dropped by the spoonful into a hot skillet, slicked with grease, and pressed flat until the edges went lace crisp and brown. The inside stayed tender while the outside crackled. Polish, German, and Jewish families brought this to tenement kitchens in Chicago, Milwaukee, and New York, and it spread through every neighborhood where potatoes were cheap and meat was not. A few potatoes and 1 egg fed a family, served with applesauce if there was fruit, or just salt if there was not. The smell of them frying pulled children in from the yard. It looked like effort. It cost like nothing. And every plate came back clean. Number 22, potato milk gravy over bread. Here is a supper so humble it never made it into a cookbook, yet it fed millions. When your grandmother boiled potatoes, she never threw out the water. That cloudy, starchy potato water became the base for a gravy. She melted a little grease in a pan, stirred in a spoonful of flour until it turned the color of a paper bag, Then poured in the potato water and a splash of milk, whisking until it thickened into a pale, savory gravy. Poured over torn slices of day-old white bread, that gravy became dinner. The starch from the potato water gave it body without a drop of cream. Salt and a heavy hand of black pepper were the only seasoning. In farmhouses across Iowa and Nebraska, this appeared on nights when the meat was gone and the paycheck was days away. It cost the price of 2 slices of bread and a spoon of flour, and it sent children to bed with full stomachs. Number 21. Potato and egg skillet. When your grandmother had a few potatoes and a couple of eggs, she could put a whole meal in one pan. She fried diced potatoes in grease until they turned tender and golden, then cracked 2 or 3 eggs right over the top and scrambled everything together until the eggs set in soft curds that clung to the potatoes. A little onion went in if there was one, salt, pepper, and if the family was lucky, a scrap of leftover ham or a slice of bologna torn in. Eggs cost about 60 cents a dozen in the 1950s, and potatoes were pennies, so this fed 4 people for almost nothing. It was breakfast, it was supper, it was whatever the hour demanded. Coal country mothers made it before dawn for men heading into the mines. Farm wives made it at dusk for men coming in from the fields. 1 skillet, 1 burner, 5 minutes of standing, and everyone ate. Number 20. Boiled potatoes with butter and salt. Do not laugh at this one until you understand it. For families in the leanest years, a pot of potatoes boiled in their skins, peeled hot, and eaten with a scrape of butter and a heavy pinch of salt was a real supper. That was it. Nothing else on the plate. The potato itself, cooked right, was sweet and earthy and satisfying in a way that surprised anyone who had only ever eaten them as a side. Your grandmother would boil a dozen small potatoes, drain them, and set the pot in the middle of the table so everyone could reach in. A little buttermilk poured over the top was an Appalachian touch that added tang and made the whole thing feel like more. Potatoes cost almost nothing by the sack, and the butter was often the only luxury on the table. This was the meal that proved a family did not need much to eat well. It just needed potatoes and a little salt. First pattern break. Here is where you understand why the potato mattered so much. No other food on earth gave a poor family more calories, more nutrition, and more full bellies for less money. A single acre of potatoes fed more people than an acre of almost any grain. They grew in bad soil, in short seasons, in cold ground that killed other crops. They stored for months in a cellar without spoiling, and a nickel's worth could feed a family for a night. When the Irish came to America fleeing a famine caused by the loss of this one crop, they knew better than anyone what the potato meant. It was not a side dish to them. It was the line between eating and starving. That knowledge came with them, and it settled into kitchens across the whole country. The potato was democratic. It did not care if you were a coal miner in Kentucky or a factory worker in Detroit. It fed you the same. Number 19. Colcannon. The Irish grandmothers who came to America never forgot colcannon, and it fed working families for 100 years. Boiled potatoes mashed with butter and milk, then folded through with cabbage or kale that had been softened in the same pot. Sometimes a chopped green onion went in, sometimes a little of the bacon grease. The result was a mountain of creamy, green-flecked mash that filled a plate and cost next to nothing. A head of cabbage ran a nickel, potatoes came by the sack, and the whole thing fed a family for pennies. In the old country, they hit a coin or a button in the colcannon on special nights, and whoever found it had luck for the year. In America, it was simply Monday supper. The cabbage stretched the potatoes further and added something bright to cut the richness. Served with a well of melted butter in the center for dragging each forkful through, it was comfort and thrift in the same bowl. Number 18. Potato cakes from leftover mash. Nothing in your grandmother's kitchen ever went to waste, least of all leftover mashed potatoes. The next morning, that cold mash became potato cakes. She mixed the leftovers with an egg and a little flour, shaped them into patties with her hands, and fried them in a hot greased skillet until each side turned deep golden and crisp. The outside crackled. The inside stayed soft and creamy. A little grated onion or a handful of leftover corn made them better, but they needed nothing at all. This was the meal that turned last night's supper into today's, feeding a family a second time on food that would otherwise have been thrown out. Served with a fried egg on top, or just eaten out of hand, potato cakes were a Saturday morning staple in farmhouses from Vermont to Texas. Your grandmother did not call it reducing waste or repurposing leftovers. She called it not wasting good food, and it fed people for free. Number 17. Scalloped potatoes. When your grandmother wanted to make something that felt like Sunday, even on a Tuesday, she made scalloped potatoes. Thin slices of potato layered in a baking dish with flour, salt, pepper, dots of butter, and enough milk to nearly cover them. Then baked slow for an hour until the top browned and the milk thickened into a creamy sauce that bound the whole thing together. There was no cheese in the poor man's version, and it needed none. The potatoes made their own richness as the starch dissolved into the milk. A dish this size fed 6 people and cost the price of a few potatoes and a cup of milk. In the Midwest, no church potluck or funeral supper was complete without a pan of it. The edges caramelized against the dish, and everyone fought over the crispy corners. It looked like abundance. It looked like a woman who had put real effort into feeding her family. It cost almost nothing at all. Number 16. Potato and salt pork stew. This was the meal that built the working class and then got forgotten by it. A fist-sized chunk of salt pork, that heavily cured fatback that lived in every cellar, cut into pieces and rendered in the bottom of a pot until the fat ran and the meat crisped. Then diced potatoes and an onion went in, covered with water, and simmered until the potatoes broke down and thickened the broth into something silky and deeply flavored. Salt pork cost about 12 cents a pound and lasted for weeks. Potatoes came by the sack. This pot fed a family of 8 and left leftovers for the next day. The rendered pork gave the whole thing a smoky depth that made it taste far more expensive than it was. Served with cornbread crumbled right into the bowl, it was the meal that got Appalachian and Southern families through hard winters, bad harvest, and every week the money ran short. Today it is almost gone from the American table. Number 15. Hot German potato salad. Do not confuse this with the cold, mayonnaise-heavy potato salad at a summer cookout. This was something older and smarter, brought by German grandmothers to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the whole German belt of the Midwest. Boiled potatoes, sliced warm, dressed with a hot bacon dressing made right in the skillet. Your grandmother fried a few pieces of bacon or fatback, then poured off most of the grease and stirred in vinegar, a spoonful of sugar, and a little flour to thicken it. That hot, tangy dressing went over the warm potatoes and soaked straight in, seasoning them from the inside. A little onion and the crumbled bacon finished it. Served warm, it was a full meal on a working night, filling and sharp and rich all at once. Bacon ends cost a fraction of full slices, and a few potatoes went a long way. This was the dish that made a little bit of pork flavor an entire pot of potatoes. Second pattern break. Here is something the food industry does not want you to think about. These potato dinners cost almost nothing because there is no money in them. A sack of potatoes carries no brand loyalty. No company runs television commercials for an onion. The profit margin on a raw potato is measured in fractions of a penny, which is exactly why no celebrity chef builds a cookbook around fried potatoes and gravy, and no frozen food aisle sells you a bag of potato and salt pork stew. Instead, they took the potato, the cheapest and most nourishing food a family could buy, and sold it back to us as frozen fries and boxed flakes and chips in a bag, marked up 10 times over. They convinced us that the potato needed a factory to make it worth eating. Your grandmother knew the truth. A potato, a little fat, and a fire were all it ever took. Everything after that was somebody else's profit. Number 14. Potato soup with evaporated milk. If one meal defined the Depression-era kitchen, it was this: diced potatoes and an onion simmered in water with a piece of salt pork until the potatoes were soft enough to break with a spoon. Then your grandmother mashed some of them right in the pot to thicken the broth and poured in a can of carnation evaporated milk to turn the whole thing creamy without any cream at all. Evaporated milk cost about 9 cents a can and kept in the pantry for months, which mattered when the icebox was empty. Salt, pepper, and a pat of butter finished it. This soup fed more American families through the lean post-war years than any government program ever did. It was soft enough for old people with no teeth, cheap enough for families with no money, and filling enough to send children to bed satisfied. Church ladies still make it for homebound neighbors. Your grandmother made it because it worked, and it never once failed her. Number 13. Poor man's cheesy potatoes. When there was a little cheese to spare, your grandmother made something the children remembered for the rest of their lives. Sliced or diced potatoes layered in a dish with whatever cheese was on hand, often the block of government cheese that came from the relief programs, along with milk, salt, and pepper. Baked until the potatoes went tender and the cheese melted into a golden, bubbling blanket over the top. A single block of cheese stretched across a whole pan, and a few potatoes turned it into a meal. In the 1960s and the 1970s, this was the casserole that showed up at every family gathering, every church basement supper, every wake. It cost a fraction of what a meat dish did and disappeared twice as fast. The corners crisped against the dish and turned chewy and dark, and those were the pieces everyone reached for first. It was the taste of a mother making a little bit of something good stretch to cover everyone at the table. Number 12. Corned beef hash. A can of corned beef cost very little, and in your grandmother's hands it became a meal that tasted like a diner breakfast. Diced potatoes fried in a hot skillet until they started to brown. Then the corned beef broken up and mixed in, along with an onion, and pressed flat so the whole thing formed a crust on the bottom. She would let it sit without stirring until that crust went deep and crisp, then flip sections of it over. A fried egg on top turned it into supper. The salty, peppery beef seasoned the potatoes, and the potatoes stretched the one small can across an entire family. This was the meal that fed men after long shifts and children before school, cheap and hot and filling. Some grandmothers used leftover pot roast instead of the can when they had it. Either way, it was proof that a little bit of meat and a lot of potatoes could feed a whole house without anyone leaving the table hungry. Number 11. Potato dumplings. The German and Czech grandmothers of the Midwest made potato dumplings that could turn a pot of broth into a feast. Boiled potatoes, riced or mashed fine, mixed with flour, an egg, and salt into a soft dough, then rolled into balls and dropped into simmering broth, or salted water until they floated to the top, light and tender. Kartoffelklöße, they called them in the old country. In Wisconsin and Nebraska kitchens, they were just dumplings, served with a little browned butter poured over or set alongside a thin gravy. They made a supper out of almost nothing. A few potatoes and a cup of flour fed a family. The dumplings were soft and pillowy, soaking up whatever they were served with, and heavy enough to keep a working man full through an afternoon. Sunday dinners across the German belt were built around them. They took patience and a good hand, and every grandmother's turned out a little different, which was exactly how the family liked them. Number 10. Potato and green bean pot. In late summer, when the garden was heavy with beans, your grandmother made a pot that fed the family for days. Fresh green beans snapped into pieces, diced potatoes, an onion, and a piece of salt pork or a ham bone, all covered with water and simmered slow for an hour or more until the beans went soft and the potatoes started to fall apart. This was not the crisp, bright green bean of a modern kitchen. These beans cooked down until they were tender and silky, and the potatoes thickened the pot liquor into a broth worth sopping up with cornbread. In the South and Appalachia, this appeared on the table all through the growing season because the garden gave the beans for free and the potatoes cost pennies. The salt pork tied it all together with a smoky richness. It was a whole meal in one pot, cheap, filling, and made from whatever the garden and the cellar could spare that week. Number 9. Cottage pie with a potato crust. When your grandmother had a little ground beef, she made it feed twice as many people by hiding it under a blanket of mashed potatoes. A small amount of browned beef and onion, stretched with whatever vegetables were on hand, spread in the bottom of a dish, then covered completely with a thick layer of mashed potato and baked until the top turned golden and the edges crisped. A pound of ground beef that would have fed 3 people fed 6 this way because the potato did most of the work. The English called it cottage pie, and the working families who brought it to America kept the name or dropped it, depending on the town. Either way, it was the meal that made a little meat go a long way, browned and savory underneath, creamy and crisp on top. Children who would not touch a plain vegetable ate every bite when it was buried under potatoes. It looked like a real Sunday dinner. It cost like a Tuesday. Third pattern, break. Here is what nobody says out loud about these meals. They were not just cheap. They were an act of love and endurance, made by women who were tired in a way most of us will never understand. A grandmother standing at a stove after a full day of work, peeling potatoes with hands that ached, feeding a family on almost nothing, night after night, without complaint and without praise. There was a quiet dignity in it. She took the humblest thing in the kitchen, a bag of potatoes worth a few cents, and turned it into something warm that told her children they were cared for. That is why these recipes survived. Not because they were fancy, but because every plate carried a message that could not be bought at any price. Somebody stayed up. Somebody made do. Somebody made sure that no matter how thin the week got, there was a hot supper on the table and a full stomach before bed. Number 8. Poor man's gnocchi. The Italian grandmothers who settled in the tenement neighborhoods of New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago brought a way of turning potatoes into a pasta that cost almost nothing. Boiled potatoes mashed smooth, mixed with flour and a little egg into a soft dough, rolled into ropes, and cut into small pillows. Dropped into boiling water, they cooked in a minute, rising to the top when they were done. Tossed with a little butter or a thin tomato sauce made from a cheap can, they became a supper that filled a family for pennies. A few potatoes and a cup of flour made enough gnocchi for everyone, with leftovers for the next day. The dough took a gentle hand because too much flour made them tough, and every grandmother knew by feel exactly when to stop. Modern restaurants sell a plate of them for the price of a whole family's supper. In the old neighborhoods, they were simply what you made when the meat was gone and the mouths still needed feeding. Number 7, potato bread. When flour was dear and the family still needed bread, your grandmother stretched it with potatoes. Mashed potato worked into the dough made a loaf that rose taller, stayed moist for days, and used less of the expensive flour. The starch from the potato fed the yeast and kept the crumb soft long after ordinary bread had gone stale. A loaf like this cost a fraction of what it would have without the potato, and it lasted through a week of packed lunches and breakfast toast. In Irish, German, and Appalachian kitchens alike, potato bread was the smart baker's secret. Some grandmothers used the leftover potato water in place of milk to stretch it even further. The result was a tender, faintly sweet loaf that made a working man's sandwich something to look forward to. It was thrift, baked right into the bread. Nothing was wasted, not the potato, not the water it boiled in, and certainly not a crumb of the finished loaf. Number 6, mashed potato patties. This is the dish that made a plate of leftover mashed potatoes feel like a brand new supper. Your grandmother shaped cold mashed potato into thick patties, sometimes rolling them in a little flour or cracker crumbs, and fried them in a greased skillet until each side formed a deep golden crust. Some versions hid a bit of cheese or a spoonful of leftover meat in the center. The outside shattered when you bit in, and the inside was hot and creamy. A whole meal came out of food that had already been served once. 2 patties and a fried egg fed a person well, and the cost was nothing at all because the potatoes were already paid for. In farmhouse kitchens across the country, this appeared the morning after any big potato supper. It taught children that leftovers were not a lesser meal, but a second chance at a good one. Crisp, rich, and satisfying, it stretched one pot of potatoes across 2 days without anyone minding at all. Number 5, baked potato with drippings. Before sour cream and bacon bits and all the modern toppings, a baked potato was a supper on its own. Your grandmother rubbed a big potato with a little grease, buried it in the coals of the wood stove, or set it in the oven that was already hot from baking, and let it cook until the skin went crackling crisp and the inside turned fluffy. Split open, it got a spoonful of the drippings saved from Sunday's roast, or a pat of butter, and a heavy shake of salt. That golden fat soaked into the soft flesh and turned a plain potato into something rich and filling. 1 large potato was a whole meal for a child, 2 for a working man. It cost a few pennies and used the heat the stove was already giving off, so it was practically free to cook. The crisp skin was the best part, eaten last, salty and chewy. It was the simplest kind of abundance a poor kitchen could offer. Number 4, potato cornbread. In the South, where cornmeal cost half what wheat flour did, grandmothers found a way to make even that go further with potatoes. Mashed potato worked into a cornbread batter made it moist and tender in a way plain cornmeal never was, and it stretched the batter to fill a bigger skillet. Baked in a hot, greased cast iron pan until the bottom formed a deep, crackling crust, it came out golden and heavy and filling. A wedge of it crumbled into a bowl of beans or a pot of greens was a full supper for a working family. Cornmeal was cheap, potatoes were cheaper, and together they fed a house for almost nothing. The potato kept the bread from going dry and crumbly, which meant leftovers were just as good the next day. This was the kind of quiet kitchen wisdom that never got written down, passed from mother to daughter by watching and doing. It made the cheapest bread in the pantry stretch even further. Number 3, potato water gravy over biscuits. Here is the one mothers were almost ashamed to serve, and it fed families through the very worst weeks. When there was no meat and no drippings, your grandmother could still make a gravy from nothing but the water her potatoes had boiled in. A little grease and flour cooked into a paste. Then that cloudy, starchy potato water whisked in and simmered until it thickened into a pale, silky gravy. Heavy on the black pepper, a pinch of salt, and if there was milk to spare, a splash to make it richer. Poured over split biscuits or torn bread, it became supper on the nights when the cupboard was truly bare. It cost almost nothing at all, the price of a spoon of flour and the water that would have gone down the drain. There was a kind of magic in it, making a real meal out of what most people threw away. It kept children fed when there was, by any honest accounting, nothing left to feed them. Number 2, hobo potatoes. This was the everything in one pan meal, and it changed with whatever the kitchen had that week. Diced potatoes, sliced onion, and whatever scraps of meat could be spared, a bit of bologna, a leftover sausage, a few pieces of bacon, all cooked together in a covered skillet until the potatoes were tender and browned and the whole thing had melted into one savory tangle. Some families wrapped it in foil and cooked it in the coals. Some made it in a cast iron pan on the stove. Either way, it used up the odds and ends that would otherwise have been wasted and turned them into a full, hot meal. It cost only what the potatoes cost, since everything else was a scrap already paid for. Depression-era families made it, and it carried right on through the lean years after the war. Every batch was a little different, which meant no 2 nights felt exactly the same. It was resourcefulness you could eat, seasoned by whatever the week had left behind. Number 1, a pot of stewed potatoes and milk. At the very top of this list is the meal so plain that naming it almost feels like a letdown, and yet it fed more poor American families than anything else the potato ever gave us. Peeled potatoes cut into chunks, simmered in a pot with an onion until they were soft and starting to fall apart, then finished with a good pour of milk and a pat of butter and let to bubble until the milk went creamy and thick against the potato starch. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. That was the whole recipe. In coal mining towns across Kentucky and West Virginia, in Dust Bowl farmhouses, in tenement kitchens, from Cleveland to Baltimore, this was the meal that appeared when everything else ran out. Potatoes cost a few cents a pound. Milk was already in the icebox. It was soft enough for the oldest grandparent and the youngest child, filling enough to send a working man back out the door, and cheap enough to make on the worst week of the year. It was not a meal of defeat. It was survival, made warm and creamy in a bowl, and it kept whole towns alive through winters that should have broken them. Your grandmother made it without a recipe, without a second thought, because her mother made it, and her mother's mother before that. It is the meal we should remember most. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The fried potatoes and onions, the stewed potatoes and milk, the scalloped potatoes, the potato cakes, Then come back and tell me if your grandmother was just being frugal or if she actually knew something we forgot. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the potato and salt pork stew gets more love than the colcannon. Because these were never just cheap dinners. They were proof that a sack of potatoes and a little love could feed a family through anything. Your grandmother knew. Now you know too.